Tonight I'll show you the fastest way to end resistance. Not affirmations, not effort, but a shift so subtle reality reorganizes without permission. The moment you accept that conditions dictate how you feel, you unknowingly surrender creative power and reinforce the state you are trying to escape. Neville Goddard dismantled this illusion with a deceptively simple image: the shadow. Circumstances, he explained, are not causes. They are effects. They are projections, not origins. Fighting a shadow on the wall accomplishes nothing, because the shadow has no independent life. It moves only when the body moves. In the same way, what you call reality is the afterimage of previous assumptions, previous states of consciousness, previous ways of seeing yourself. When you resist conditions, attempt to fix them directly, or emotionally wrestle with them, you are not dissolving their power. You are feeding it. Attention, especially emotionally charged attention, is agreement. Resistance is still participation. What is almost never questioned is perception itself. People try to change what they see without realizing that how they see is the actual lever. Perception is not passive observation. It is interpretation, meaning, and assumption operating silently in the background. Two individuals can look at the same event and walk away with entirely different emotional realities, not because the event changed, but because perception did. When perception shifts, the emotional response shifts. When the emotional response shifts, the state shifts. And when the state shifts, reality reorganizes to match it. The mistake is trying to manipulate the outer picture instead of revising the inner lens. Modern science, interestingly enough, has begun to echo what mystics like Neville taught decades ago. Joe Dispenza explains that perception precedes biology and environment, that the body and brain respond not to the world as it is, but to the world as it is interpreted. The nervous system does not wait for circumstances to change before it recalibrates. It responds to meaning. Change the meaning and the chemistry changes. Change the chemistry and behavior changes. Change behavior consistently, and the environment must eventually reflect it. This is not philosophy layered on top of reality. It is the mechanism by which reality expresses itself. The reason most people remain stuck is not because they lack techniques, affirmations, or discipline. It is because they continue to grant authority to appearances. They keep asking reality for permission to feel different, not realizing that feeling different is the permission. The inner argument goes unnoticed. When this changes, then I'll relax. When that improves, then I'll feel secure. But that conditional piece guarantees delay because it places fulfillment in the future and power outside the self. Reality, being mechanical rather than personal, simply mirrors the assumption embedded in that posture. This is where the fight ends, not by overpowering circumstances, but by withdrawing the false belief that they are in charge. The shift you are about to explore is not about denial, blind optimism, or forcing positivity. It is about understanding a fundamental law. Reality has no choice but to follow a revised self-concept. When perception changes at the root, conditions are compelled to rearrange, not as a reward, not as a favor, but as a consequence. The struggle was never necessary. It only appeared so because the order of cause and effect was misunderstood. You can't defeat a shadow by punching it. There is a quiet frustration that builds when effort seems sincere, but results remain unchanged. People push harder, analyze more, and apply greater force to their circumstances, assuming that persistence alone must eventually overpower conditions. Yet this approach always ends the same way: temporary relief at best, followed by the return of the very situation they tried to eliminate. The reason is subtle but absolute. Reality always wins the fight because it is not the opponent, it is the echo. Struggle feels necessary only when cause and effect are reversed in the mind. Neville Goddard was unwavering on this point. He insisted that circumstances are already finished products, crystallized expressions of past assumptions. What you are reacting to now is not being created now. It is being revealed now. To fight an effect is to arrive too late. This is why circumstances feel so solid and convincing. They carry the weight of completion. They are not asking for permission to exist. They are reporting what consciousness has already agreed to. When you attempt to change them directly, you are arguing with yesterday's decision while unknowingly repeating it today. The analogy of the mirror exposes the futility with surgical clarity. Imagine standing before a mirror, dissatisfied with the reflection. and attempting to scrub the glass until the image changes. No matter how intense the effort, the reflection remains faithful. The mirror is not stubborn, it is obedient. Reality functions the same way. It does not resist you, but it does not negotiate either. It reflects the state you occupy, not the effort you exert. When you struggle with circumstances, you are scrubbing the mirror while refusing to move your own body. This is why resistance strengthens what it tries to destroy. Attention charged with emotion binds consciousness to the very state it claims to reject. Anger, fear, urgency, and obsession all signal identification. They announce to the subconscious that the condition is important, real, and authoritative. The more you fight, the more you confirm. Neville warned that struggle is not neutral, it is creative. It anchors awareness in the old state and keeps the cycle intact, even when the conscious mind believes it is working toward change. The paradox is that surrendering attention does not mean surrendering power. It means reclaiming it. When you stop wrestling with appearances, you stop feeding the state that produced them. Reality does not collapse because you attacked it. It reorganizes because you withdrew agreement. This is the first crack in the illusion of opposition. If fighting reality strengthens it, then the weakening begins not with force but with the quiet refusal to continue participating in the old meaning. Reality moves when meaning changes. What quietly governs experience is not the event itself but the meaning assigned to it. The same words, the same glance, the same delay, or the same circumstance can feel devastating in one moment and completely neutral in another. Nothing external has shifted, yet the inner response transforms everything. This reveals a truth most people overlook. Perception is not a reaction to reality. It is the filter through which reality is allowed to register. The emotional charge you experience is never coming from the event alone, but from the assumptions silently attached to it. Consider how a single word can sting deeply when the mood is insecure, yet pass unnoticed when confidence is stable. The sound waves do not change. The definition does not change. What changes is the inner position from which the word is received. Perception assigns weight, importance, and threat. It determines whether the nervous system contracts or remains calm, whether the mind spirals or stays grounded. In this way, perception becomes the translator between the world and the self, shaping not only how events feel, but which events even appear meaningful at all. Neville Goddard described perception as assumption in motion. You do not wait for evidence to perceive. You perceive based on what you assume to be true. Two people can stand in the same room, experience the same interaction, and walk away living in entirely different realities. One carries offense, anticipation of rejection, or fear of loss. The other carries indifference or ease. Their futures diverge immediately, not because reality split, but because perception selected different meanings and therefore different states. This is why attempting to force perception to change through logic or repetition rarely works. You can argue with yourself endlessly, but perception does not obey commands, it follows identity. The way you interpret life is inseparable from how you define yourself within it. If the self-concept remains untouched, perception will always snap back to its familiar pattern, regardless of how much mental effort is applied. Meaning does not shift because you demand it to. It shifts because the one doing the perceiving has quietly changed. Here, the illusion of control begins to dissolve. You are not meant to micromanage reactions or monitor every thought. Perception reorganizes naturally when the internal reference point changes. When identity softens or expands, meaning recalibrates without effort. Events that once felt heavy lose their charge. Situations that once triggered urgency feel distant or irrelevant. Reality appears to move, but in truth, meaning moved first. And once meaning changes, the entire emotional and experiential landscape follows, because perception is the real lever shaping the world you live in. You don't see life as it is, you see life as you are. At a deeper level, perception is not random, nor is it neutral. It is selected. What you notice, emphasize, and emotionally react to is determined long before the event occurs, shaped by the quiet definition you hold of yourself. This is why people often feel as though life is happening to them in predictable patterns. It is not coincidence repeating itself, it is self-concept expressing itself. The world appears consistent because the observer remains consistent. Change the observer, and the scene cannot help but reorganize. Self-concept operates like a set of invisible lenses through which everything is interpreted. Imagine walking through the same landscape wearing tinted glasses. The hills, the sky, and the streets are unchanged, yet the entire world seems altered. Nothing external has shifted, but everything appears different. This is precisely how identity functions. The assumptions you hold about who you are determine what feels possible, threatening, natural, or out of reach. Perception does not evaluate life objectively. It filters life through identity and calls the result reality. Neville Goddard taught that self-definition is the selector of experience. You do not attract what you want. You encounter what you are. This is why affirmations often fail when they remain superficial. Words repeated without a corresponding shift in identity become noise. The subconscious does not respond to language alone. It responds to congruence. If the self-concept remains anchored in lack, effort, or waiting, perception will continue to highlight evidence that confirms it, regardless of how positive the statements sound. This explains the exhaustion many feel after trying to think differently while still feeling the same internally. They are attempting to override perception from the surface while identity remains intact beneath it. Perception, loyal to self-concept, inevitably reasserts itself. It is not sabotaging progress. It is protecting coherence. The mind prefers consistency over optimism. Until identity shifts, perception will continue to scan reality for familiar confirmations, recreating the same emotional responses and reinforcing the same patterns. The turning point comes with the realization that you do not revise self-concept by wrestling with thoughts. Identity is not changed through argument or force. It softens when a new state is entered and experienced as natural. When the feeling of being changes, perception follows automatically, without instruction. The lenses change, and the world looks different not because you demanded it to, but because there is no other way it can appear. This is the quiet authority of self-concept. It precedes perception, and perception obediently carries its assumptions forward into experience. Fighting stops when the outcome feels final. There is a noticeable shift that occurs when something is no longer in question. The body relaxes, the mind stops scanning for danger, and the urgency that once dominated attention quietly dissolves. This is the state Neville referred to as living in the end, not as a technique, but as a psychological conclusion. Resistance exists only where there is uncertainty. The moment an outcome feels settled internally, the argument with reality ends, not because circumstances have changed, but because the state generating resistance has collapsed. Neville Goddard often compared this to the simple relief that follows confirmation. When a package has been ordered but not yet acknowledged, attention remains restless. Thoughts return repeatedly to the question of arrival. But once confirmation is received, worry evaporates even though the package has not physically arrived yet. Nothing external has changed, yet everything internal has. The nervous system responds not to the object itself, but to the feeling of completion. The wish in that moment is fulfilled psychologically. This fulfilled feeling is not excitement or emotional intensity. It is relief. It is the absence of strain. It is the quiet knowing that there is nothing left to do, nothing to push, and nothing to fix. When this feeling stabilizes, urgency loses its grip, and anxiety dissolves without effort. The mind stops revisiting the same questions because the internal conversation has ended. In this relaxed state, perception reorganizes itself naturally, no longer scanning the environment for proof or threat. Resistance fades because it has no function once the outcome feels final. The body cannot remain tense around something it considers complete. This is why forcing belief never works. Belief is not a command, it is a conclusion. When the inner state reaches the point of acceptance, the senses may still protest, presenting evidence that contradicts the assumption. But these protests lack the same emotional authority they once had. They are heard but not obeyed. This is where many turn back, mistaking sensory feedback for truth. Yet the senses are always reporting what has already been impressed, not what is being selected now. When the feeling of the wish fulfilled becomes dominant, the internal environment stabilizes and perception adjusts accordingly. The struggle ends not because reality has been convinced, but because the state that required convincing has been abandoned. In that abandonment, reality begins its inevitable rearrangement, reflecting the inner conclusion with mechanical precision. Facts are loud, but they're late. The senses speak with confidence, urgency, and volume. They present facts as though they are final, demanding immediate recognition and emotional response. What is seen, heard, and experienced feels authoritative precisely because it is tangible. Yet this authority is borrowed, not original. Sensory data is always reporting what has already solidified, never what is being selected now. It feels current, but it is delayed. It feels powerful, but it is derivative. This is why relying on appearances inevitably locks perception into repetition. Neville Goddard described this delay with striking clarity. Facts, he reminded, are residual impressions. They are the after-effects of prior states of consciousness, the visible residue of assumptions once held. To treat them as predictors of what must come next is like reading yesterday's newspaper to understand today's unfolding events. The information may be accurate, but it is no longer creative. It explains what has been, not what is being generated. The conflict arises when consciousness becomes divided. On one side is the inner assumption quietly forming, and on the other is sensory logic insisting that what appears must be obeyed. When attention leans toward the senses, perception collapses back into the familiar. Arguments form internally, trying to reconcile the wish with the evidence, and in that argument the old state regains dominance. Sensory logic does not need to be aggressive, it only needs to be believed. The moment appearances are treated as final, perception freezes. What keeps this cycle active is not the presence of facts, but the act of negotiating with them. Explaining, justifying, resisting, or emotionally reacting to appearances keeps awareness anchored in their meaning. The senses thrive on engagement. They grow louder when answered. This is why arguing with reality never produces movement. It sustains the assumption that appearances are the reference point, and as long as they are, perception has nowhere new to go. When attention finally withdraws from sensory authority, something subtle begins to happen. The facts do not immediately vanish, but their emotional weight diminishes. They lose their power to define what is possible. In that withdrawal, perception loosens its grip on the old narrative, and reality is no longer being continuously reinforced. Rearrangement does not begin with visible change. It begins with silence, with the absence of reaction. In that quiet, the delayed nature of facts is revealed, and perception becomes free to select again. What you notice, you consent to. Attention is rarely seen as creative, yet it is one of the most decisive forces shaping experience. Whatever holds awareness gains legitimacy, not because it is true, but because it is being acknowledged. Attention does not evaluate, it endorses. When something is repeatedly noticed, revisited, or emotionally engaged with, it becomes stabilized in consciousness. This is how unwanted states persist. They are not sustained by intention, but by focus. To attend is to agree that something matters. Neville Goddard expressed this through a simple but revealing analogy. Applauding a performance while claiming to dislike it sends a mixed message, yet the applause is what registers. In the same way, attention given to a condition, even in the form of complaint or resistance, functions as participation. The subconscious does not differentiate between approval and fixation. It recognizes only emphasis. What is emphasized is prolonged. This is why attempts to fix circumstances often entrench them further. Fixing requires focus, and focus implies importance. When awareness circles a problem, analyzing it, revisiting it, or monitoring it for signs of change, the state that produced it remains active. The outer condition is being treated as the reference point, and perception remains oriented around it. Attention becomes a loop, feeding back into the same assumption that created the experience in the first place. Neville's instruction was not to battle attention, but to relocate it. He emphasized the power of feeling elsewhere, of allowing awareness to rest in a different state rather than correcting the current one. Attention follows feeling naturally. When the internal atmosphere shifts, attention drifts with it, no longer magnetized by the old condition. The unwanted state begins to dissolve, not through confrontation, but through neglect. As attention disengages, the agreement that sustained the condition quietly expires. Reality does not resist this withdrawal, it responds to it. Without continuous acknowledgement, the old state loses coherence. Perception, no longer anchored to the familiar narrative, becomes available for reorganization. This is not an act of suppression or avoidance. It is the natural consequence of no longer consenting to define oneself through what is being observed. In that withdrawal of attention, the groundwork for change is laid without force. Sleep is where the argument ends. There is a point where effort becomes unnecessary, where the mind no longer debates, evaluates, or resists. This point exists naturally on the edge of sleep. As wakefulness softens, the sharp boundaries of logic dissolve, and the constant commentary of the conscious mind grows quiet. In this state, perception becomes fluid. Meaning is no longer defended with the same rigidity, and identity is momentarily loosened. This is why Neville placed such importance on the state akin to sleep. It is not mystical escapism, but the most practical doorway to change perception at its source. Neville Goddard explained that SATS is where impressions are accepted without argument. During waking hours, the mind is trained to compare, reject, and cross-examine every idea against sensory evidence. But in the drowsy state, that guard relaxes. Assumptions slip past resistance and settle directly into feeling. This is why SATS does not rely on effort or repetition. It works because the conscious interference that normally blocks new states is temporarily offline. The analogy is precise. Editing a document before it is printed, not after. Once a belief is printed into experience, correcting it becomes difficult and delayed. But when perception is revised before it hardens into fact, the outer expression has no choice but to follow the new template. In SATS, perception is edited at the level of meaning, not behavior. The nervous system receives a different conclusion about reality, and it responds accordingly, reorganizing emotional patterns without struggle. What distinguishes effective use of this state is not intensity, but subtlety. The feeling of the wish fulfilled in SATS is not excitement or anticipation. It is relief. It is the quiet satisfaction that nothing needs to happen because it already has, internally. This feeling carries finality. There is no urgency in it, no pushing, no mental commentary. It feels settled. That settled quality is what communicates completion to the subconscious. As this feeling is accepted, perception begins to shift effortlessly. Events are interpreted differently. Reactions soften. Situations that once provoked anxiety feel distant or irrelevant. This is not because the individual is trying to remain calm, but because the internal argument has ended. The subconscious has received a new assumption and no longer signals threat or lack. Reality begins adjusting not in response to conscious desire, but in obedience to the new state being occupied. Sleep, in this sense, is not escape. It is authority. It is where the debate between desire and evidence dissolves, and perception is allowed to reset without resistance. When this reset occurs consistently, the outer world is compelled to reorganize, not symbolically, not metaphorically, mechanically. Because when perception changes at the root, reality has no alternative response. At a certain point, the struggle dissolves not because circumstances improve, but because the mechanics behind them are finally understood. Reality is not weighing options, testing your worthiness, or deciding whether to cooperate. It is responding automatically. The idea that reality could choose otherwise is part of the illusion that sustains effort and doubt. Once this illusion collapses, the relationship with the world changes fundamentally. There is no longer a sense of negotiation, only alignment. Neville Goddard emphasized that the law of assumption is impersonal and exact. Reality behaves less like a judge and more like a mirror. A mirror does not consider whether it agrees with what stands before it. It reflects. It has no memory, no preference, and no resistance. When the face changes, the reflection follows instantly. In the same way, when the inner state changes consistently, the outer world must follow not as an act of kindness, but as a function of law. The thermostat analogy captures this inevitability with precision. When the temperature in a room shifts, the thermostat does not argue with the change or ask how it happened. It simply responds. Reality operates with the same neutrality. The dominant state sets the tone, and the environment adjusts. Time and conditions do not override this process. They only appear relevant when the state is unstable. Consistency of consciousness outweighs duration and circumstance every time. This is why emotional consistency matters more than momentary intensity. A brief surge of belief, followed by habitual doubt, does not establish a new state. Reality reflects what is occupied most naturally, not what is visited occasionally. When a state becomes familiar, when it feels like the default rather than the exception, reality reorganizes with surprising efficiency. The delay people experience is not resistance from the world, but fluctuation within themselves. Understanding this removes the last trace of struggle. Reality is not personal and it is not adversarial. It is obedient. It responds to what is assumed, not to what is wished for. When this is fully grasped, effort gives way to composure. There is no need to monitor progress or interpret signs. The mirror cannot disobey the face, and reality cannot contradict the state that is being consistently lived. With this understanding, the fight ends permanently, because it is clear that there was never an opponent to defeat, only a reflection waiting for instruction. What finally dissolves here is not a circumstance, a delay, or a problem, but a deeply rooted misunderstanding about how life actually moves. The exhaustion so many people feel does not come from their situations alone, but from the belief that reality must be confronted, managed, corrected, or persuaded before peace is possible. This belief quietly trains the nervous system to stay alert, vigilant, and reactive, as if life were an adversary waiting to be outmaneuvered. Yet the deeper truth Neville returned to again and again is simple and unsettling. Reality was never opposing you. It was responding to you. The effort belonged to a false order of causation. Neville Goddard distilled this principle into a single instruction that cuts through all complexity. Change self, not scenes. Scenes are transient. They are snapshots of consciousness already impressed. When attention remains fixed on appearances, trying to negotiate with them emotionally or mentally, perception stays anchored to the past. The scene feels solid only because it is being continually reinterpreted through the same identity that produced it. Once that identity loosens, the scene loses its authority. It no longer has a reference point inside from which to draw meaning. This is why circumstances often begin to dissolve when they are no longer being fought. The withdrawal of perception is not avoidance, it is reorientation. When awareness stops feeding a condition with emotional significance, that condition begins to lose coherence. It may still appear for a time, but it no longer defines experience. The inner environment has shifted, and the outer world is now misaligned with it. Reality does not cling to outdated instructions. It reorganizes quietly and mechanically around the new center of gravity. At this stage, control gives way to composure. There is no urgency to monitor progress, no need to interpret signs, and no impulse to measure movement. The nervous system relaxes because the outcome feels internally concluded. This settled feeling is not passive resignation, it is psychological finality. When the wish feels already resolved within, attention naturally disengages from lack. The mind stops scanning, correcting, and bracing. Perception softens, and with it, the emotional charge that once kept old conditions alive. What appears spiritual here is, in fact, deeply functional. Modern biology has arrived at a parallel understanding. Bruce Lipton demonstrated that perception governs expression, that cells respond to signals rather than conditions. The environment does not dictate behavior nearly as much as interpretation does. Change the signal, and the expression changes. This mirrors the same law Neville articulated decades earlier on the level of consciousness. Reality follows the assumption because it has no alternative mechanism. It is not choosing, it is obeying. Seen through this lens, reality loses its dramatic weight. It is no longer personal, emotional, or punitive. It is procedural. It reflects without memory and rearranges without commentary. The delays people experience are not refusals from the world, but fluctuations within themselves. When the state is inconsistent, the reflection appears inconsistent. When the state stabilizes, the world follows with equal stability. Time and conditions do not override this process. They only seem important when identity is unsettled. This understanding marks the true end of struggle. There is nothing left to force and nothing left to fix. The work was never about dominating circumstances, but about releasing the belief that they were in charge. Entering the state akin to sleep, allowing the wish fulfilled to register as already settled, And letting perception move, first, restores the correct order of cause and effect. Reality does not need instruction once the signal is clear. What remains is a quiet authority. Life begins to feel less like a battlefield and more like a mirror, faithfully reflecting what stands before it. The effort that once consumed so much energy falls away, replaced by a grounded sense of inevitability.